The rich gunslinger's son saves a young Apache. The next day, a war party surrounds their ranch. The metallic taste of fear coated Eric's tongue as he pressed his back against the rough wooden palisade, his heart hammering like Thor's own forge. Steam rose from his trembling breath in the bitter morning air, while Saxon war cries echoed beyond the walls, primal, hungry sounds that promised death and fire. Just 12 hours ago, he had been nothing more than a merchant's disappointing son, soft hands that had never gripped a sword in true battle, living in the crushing shadow of his father's legendary reputation as both traitor and warrior. Now those same hands were stained with Saxon blood. The acrid smoke from their campfires burned his nostrils, carried on the cutting wind that swept across the rocky English borderlands. In the distance, merchants' voices rose in desperate negotiation, gold for lives, silver for safe passage. But Eric knew no amount of coin would buy them. Everything had changed when he saw her, Ayana, the Apache girl with eyes like winter storms, bound and bloodied in that Saxon slave pen. Something primal had awakened in Eric's chest, not desire, but a desperate hunger for honor that had gnawed at him for years. Against every order his father had given him, against every lesson in profitable cowardice, he had struck down her captors with savage fury that surprised even himself. The girl's bronze skin bore the marks of Saxon cruelty, but her spirit burned unbroken. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of mountains and grief deeper than fjords. E antes de continuarmos com essa história incrível, preciso te fazer alerta importante. Muitos inscritos têm relatado que o YouTube removeu suas inscrições sem aviso. Dá só uma conferida rápida no botão vermelho aí embaixo para garantir que você ainda está inscrito no canal. Não quero que você perca nenhum conteúdo exclusivo que vem por aí. E já que você está aí, deixa aquele like poderoso que me ajuda muito com o algoritmo. Ah, e me conta nos comentários de qual cidade você está assistindo. Adoro conhecer cada pessoa incrível que faz parte dessa comunidade. Sua participação faz toda a diferença. Vamos interagir. My father was Chief Naunish, she had whispered through split lips, her words carrying the weight of sacred mountains. The Saxons came with promises of peace, but a Norse trader sold them the location of our sacred meeting ground. My father died, believing in Saxon honor. Eric had felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening. Like ice splitting to reveal rushing water beneath. Here was his path to glory. Escort this daughter of a war chief back to her people. Earn honor through noble deed rather than inherited wealth. But dawn brought hell itself to their doorstep. Now Saxon steel gleamed beyond the wooden walls, and their leader's voice boomed across the trading post like thunder before the storm. Send out the Apache whore, Norse dogs. Send her out, or we burn your precious gold along with your bones. Eric's tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, dry as parchment. Behind him, footsteps approached, the familiar heavy tread of his father, Magnus Thorson, the merchant warrior whose very name opened doors across 3 kingdoms. Tell me. Ayana's voice cut through the chaos like a blade, her storm-gray eyes fixed on Eric's face. Tell me the name of your father, son of the North. Magnus Eric breathed, pride and shame warring in his voice. Magnus Thorson, the color drained from Ayana's bronze features, as if winter itself had touched her soul. Her lips parted, and the words that fell from them struck Eric like a warhammer to the chest. Magnus Thorson, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of tombstones. The Northman who shared our sacred fire. Who ate our bread? Who learned the secret paths to our holy places, and sold every detail to Saxon gold? The world tilted beneath Eric's feet. The wooden wall seemed to close in, the Saxon war cries fading to a distant roar as blood rushed in his ears. His father, his legendary father, was the architect of this girl's tragedy. Heavy footsteps stopped directly behind him. "What?" came his father's voice, low and dangerous as a blade being drawn. "Is that savage doing here?" "Eric?" The words hung in the frigid air like a death curse, and Eric felt his world shatter like ice beneath a warhammer. Magnus Thorson stepped into view, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury, hand resting on the pommel of his legendary blade. The same hands that had counted Apache gold now trembled with barely contained rage. "I asked you a question, boy," Magnus growled, his pale eyes flicking between Eric and Ayana like a wolf calculating which throat to tear first. But Ayana was already moving. With fluid grace, born of mountain winds and sacred training, she rose to her feet, her storm-gray eyes never leaving Magnus's face. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of avalanches and the fury of winter itself. "Magnus Thorson," she breathed, and something in her tone made the very air crackle with menace. "The man who taught me Norse words around our sacred fire. The man who showed me how to braid warrior knots in leather cord." Her fingers moved to her throat, touching something hidden beneath her torn buckskin shirt. "The man who gave me this." She pulled forth a pendant, carved bone, etched with runes that made Magnus's face go corpse white. The bone gleamed with an oily, unnatural sheen, and the runes seemed to writhe in the morning light like living serpents. "You remember now, don't you, Oathbreaker?" Ayana's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than the Saxon war cries beyond the walls. "The night you stumbled into our camp, half dead from Saxon arrows. How my father's medicine woman healed you. How you carved this bone with your own hand and swore the blood binding upon it." Magnus stumbled backward, his legendary composure cracking like rotten timber. "Impossible," he rasped. "That girl died. The whole camp burned. I saw the smoke myself when you led the Saxons to slaughter my people." Ayana's laugh was sharp as obsidian. "Oh yes, elder father, I died that night. The medicine woman made certain of that." She pressed the bone pendant against her chest, and Eric swore he could hear it pulsing like a heartbeat. But death, I learned, is not always permanent. Not when it's fueled by betrayal so deep it cracks the very foundations of the spirit world. The pendant began to glow with sickly phosphorescence, casting twisted shadows on the wooden walls. Eric felt ice form in his veins as understanding crashed over him like a mountain avalanche. "The blood binding," Magnus whispered, horror etching deep lines around his eyes. I swore by my bloodline, by my son's life. Ayana smiled, and her teeth gleamed white as bleached bone in a desert sun. Indeed you did, Oathbreaker. You swore that if you ever betrayed our sacred trust, your bloodline would pay the price in suffering beyond measure. And when you sold our holy places for Saxon silver, she tilted her head, studying Eric with the cold calculation of a hunting wolf. The old powers began to collect their debt. The Saxon war cries outside suddenly fell silent, as if the very air had turned solid. Every step you've taken since that night has led to this moment, Ayana continued, her voice growing stronger as the pendant's unholy light intensified. Your son saving me was not chance, Magnus Thorson. It was the binding drawing him here, compelling him to free the instrument of his own destruction. Eric's sword fell from nerveless fingers as the terrible truth crushed down upon him like a burial mound of stone and earth. The pendant's unnatural light pulsed brighter, and suddenly Eric felt something shift deep in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. A memory that wasn't his own flooded through him like ice water through cracked stone. A younger Magnus kneeling by Apache fires. A medicine woman with knowing eyes placing her hands on his fevered brow. Words spoken in the ancient tongue. The debt of blood runs deeper than one generation, Norseman. What you owe can only be paid by what you love most. Eric gasped, stumbling against the wooden wall as the foreign memory burned through his skull. That's impossible, he breathed. I wasn't there. I was never. Oh, but you were, Ayana whispered, and her smile held the cruel edge of winter wind. You were there, in your father's blood, in his very bones. The medicine woman marked him that night, and through him she marked you. She stepped closer, the pendant's glow casting her features in sharp relief. Every son carries his father's debts, Eric Magnusson, and some debts can only be collected through willing sacrifice. Magnus lunged forward, his warrior instincts finally overriding his shock. Stay away from my boy, witch. His blade sang from its skeeth, Norse steel reflecting the pendant's sickly light. But Eric's hand shot out, catching his father's wrist with strength that surprised them both. Wait, he said, his voice strange and distant. Father, when did you first dream of Apache fires? The question hung between them like a blade balanced on its edge. Magnus's face went gray as old bone. When you were 7, he whispered, the fever nearly killed you. You spoke Apache words you'd never heard, drew symbols in the dirt with your fingers. His voice broke. I thought it was just sickness, just the binding was already working. Ayana cut in, her storm-gray eyes never leaving Eric's face. It needed time to grow strong, to make you into the perfect instrument of justice. She reached out and touched Eric's cheek with fingers cold as grave earth. Every choice that led you here was guided by my people's dying curse. Your compassion, your hunger for honor, all of it shaped by forces you never suspected. The Saxon war cries outside resumed with sudden, terrifying intensity. But now they sounded different, ceremonial, ritualistic, like a funeral chant. They're not here for you. Eric realized, his voice hollow with dawning horror. The Saxons aren't here for you at all. Ayana's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. The Saxons are already dead, foolish boy. They died the moment they set foot on this cursed ground. She gestured toward the walls, where shadows moved beyond the wooden palisade. But the shadows were wrong, too tall, moving in ways that hurt to watch. What you hear out there are the spirits of my slaughtered people, wearing Saxon faces like war paint. They've been waiting 20 years for this moment. Her fingers traced patterns in the air, and the very atmosphere began to thicken, like blood, waiting for Magnus Thorson to bring his most precious thing to the place of reckoning. Magnus's legendary blade trembled in his grip. This place, we're not on Saxon borderlands at all, are we? The wooden walls around them began to shift and blur, revealing the truths beneath the illusion. Blackened earth stretched in all directions, the charred remains of Apache lodges, bones bleached white by desert sun, scattered like rune stones across ground that would never again know peace. They stood in the center of a graveyard, the very place where Magnus's betrayal had birthed genocide, and Eric's rescue of Ayana had delivered them both directly into the heart of the killing ground. Now, Ayana whispered, raising the bone pendant high above her head, the real blood price begins. The bone pendant blazed with unholy fire, casting writhing shadows across the charred Apache bones. And Eric felt the terrible binding surge through his veins like molten iron. But as Ayana raised the curse token high above her head, something impossible happened. The pendant cracked. Not shattered, cracked, like ice under sudden pressure, releasing a sound that made the very air scream in agony. From that hairline fracture poured forth not light, but absolute darkness. A void so complete, it seemed to devour the morning itself. And from that darkness stepped a figure that made Magnus fall to his knees in horror. "Hello, brother," said the man emerging from the pendant's shadow, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in the grave. Eric's world tilted sideways. The figure before them wore Apache buckskin and war paint, but his face was pure Norse. Pale eyes like winter storms, the sharp cheekbones of the northern clans, and around his throat, a silver hammer pendant that Eric had seen in his father's most treasured possessions chest. Leif, Magnus breathed, the name falling from his lips like a death rattle. Leif, you died. The fever took you when you were 16. I buried you myself. The figure, Leif, smiled with lips that held the blue tinge of corpses. Did you, Magnus? Did you really? He gestured to Ayana, who stood frozen, her storm-gray eyes wide with something that might have been terror. Or did you sell me to the Apache shamans when their medicine woman offered you a bargain too rich to refuse? The words hit Eric like a war hammer between the ribs. His uncle, his father's younger brother, the one supposedly claimed by plague, the family's grief, the locked room that smelled eternally of sage and something darker. The medicine woman needed a vessel, Leif continued, circling them like a hunting wolf. A Norse soul to bind to her granddaughter, to create something that could walk between worlds, feel compassion for her enemies, and deliver perfect vengeance. His laugh was sharp as breaking bone. You traded your own brother's life for Apache gold, Magnus, and I've spent 20 years learning their magic from the inside. Ayanna stumbled backward, touching her throat as if feeling it for the first time. "No," she whispered. "I am Chief Nanish's daughter. I remember." "You remember what we made you remember," Leif cut her off, his pale eyes filled with something beyond hatred. The girl died with the rest, but her body was strong, her spirit fierce, perfect for housing a Norse soul, twisted by betrayal into an instrument of perfect justice. He reached out and touched her face with fingers that left frost patterns on her bronze skin. "We are one being, sweet sister. Your Apache fury and my Norse cunning, woven together by medicine older than both our peoples." The ground beneath them began to crack and split, revealing not earth, but an endless void filled with screaming faces, Norse and Apache both, victims of Magnus's endless thirst for profit. "The blood binding was never about punishing you for betraying the Apache," Leif whispered, his voice now coming from Ayanna's lips as well, creating a horrible harmony. "It was about punishing you for trading your brother's soul like a sack of grain." Magnus's legendary sword clattered to the blackened earth as understanding crashed over him like an avalanche of stone. "The fever. You begged me to end your suffering. The medicine woman said she could save you, but the price was my willing sacrifice," Eric said suddenly, the words tearing from his throat without his permission. Around his neck, a pendant he'd never seen before materialized. Bone, carved with the same runes as Ayanna's, but these blazed with golden fire. "That's why you brought me here, isn't it? That's what the binding truly demands." Leif's corpse smile widened until it split his face from ear to ear. "Now you begin to understand, nephew. The debt can only be paid by willing sacrifice of what Magnus loves most, just as he sacrificed me." The pendant around Eric's neck began to burn, and he felt his very soul starting to unravel at the edges. But as the golden pendant blazed against Eric's chest, something impossible happened. Instead of his soul unraveling, the cursed bone around Ayanna's throat began to smoke and crack, filling the air with the acrid stench of burning marrow. "No," Leif snarled, his corpse face contorting with rage. "The binding is absolute. Magnus traded his brother's life, and now—" "Magnus traded nothing," came a voice from beyond the wall of shadows, strong and alive and achingly familiar. "Because his brother never died." The real Leif Thorson stepped into the cursed circle, his weathered face bearing 20 years of scars, but his pale eyes blazing with unmistakable life. Around his throat hung not silver, but a pendant of pure iron, the metal that turned aside all sorcery. Magnus's legendary composure finally shattered completely. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his battle-scarred cheeks. "Impossible. The medicine woman showed me your corpse. I held your cold body in my arms." "A changeling," Leif said grimly, his gaze fixed on the thing wearing Ayanna's face. "Crafted from shadow and false memories. The Apache shamans were more cunning than you knew, brother. They needed you to believe I was dead, so their binding could fester in guilt and grow strong. He raised his iron pendant, and the creature that had been Ayana shrieked as its flesh began to bubble and peel. But I escaped their spirit traps, and have spent 20 years learning how to break them. The ground beneath their feet began to shift and blur as the illusion of the Apache graveyard dissolved like morning mist. They stood once more in the trading post, but now Eric could see the truth. Saxon bodies lay scattered around them, throats torn not by blades, but by impossible claws. "Then who is she?" Eric gasped, staring at the writhing figure that no longer looked entirely human. Leif's expression darkened with knowledge more terrible than death itself. "Look at her hands, nephew. Look at what she truly carries." Eric's blood turned to ice water. The creature's fingers had elongated into talons, but clutched between them was not an Apache medicine pouch, but a small leather sack that bore the distinctive red dragon symbol of Eric's own family crest. The same crest that had been buried with Eric's infant sister 15 years ago. "Astrid," Magnus whispered, the name falling from his lips like a funeral bell. "But she died of winter fever. We buried her ourselves." The creature's features began to shift and blur, revealing not Apache bronze, but pale Norse skin. Not storm-gray eyes, but the bright blue that ran in their bloodline. When she spoke again, her voice carried the innocent cadence of a child who had never grown past her 5th winter. "Father sold us both to the bone witches," little Astrid lisped, her words made horrible by the fangs that had replaced her milk teeth. "Leif to the Apache shamans for gold. Me to the Saxon blood sorcerers for safe passage through their lands." Her child's face smiled with adult malice. "But the dead don't stay buried when they've been murdered by family greed." The iron pendant around Leif's neck began to glow cherry red, and his face contorted with an agony that went deeper than flesh. The binding, it wasn't just about the Apache. It was about every innocent soul Magnus sold for profit over the years. Astrid was the first, but not the last. Eric felt the golden pendant against his chest pulse with increasing heat. And suddenly he understood with crystalline horror. The willing sacrifice the curse demanded wasn't just his life. It was his willing acceptance of the truth about what his father truly was. Not a merchant warrior, not a legendary hero, a soul trader who had built his fortune on the corpses of his own blood. And now every ghost he'd created had come home to collect their due. But as the terrible truth of Magnus's soul trading settled like poison in Eric's veins, the golden pendant around his neck suddenly blazed with such fury that it seared his flesh. He screamed, clawing at the burning metal, but his fingers passed through it like smoke. "The pendant," Leif breathed, his weathered face going corpse pale. "Eric, where did you get that pendant?" I don't know," Eric gasped through the agony. "It just appeared when you saved me," little Astrid finished, her child's voice carrying ancient malice, her pale blue eyes fixed on the blazing golden bone with something that might have been fear. When you chose compassion over blood debt, when you made the willing sacrifice the curse truly demanded. The pendant's golden fire spread down Eric's chest, burning away his tunic, revealing skin beneath that bore intricate runic scars, scars that had never been there before. The marks pulsed with each heartbeat, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Leaf stumbled backward, his iron pendant suddenly cold and lifeless against his throat. Those marks, I've seen them before, in the forbidden texts of the Bone Singers. His voice cracked like breaking ice. Eric, those aren't protection runes. They're binding marks, came a new voice from the shadows, beyond the trading post walls. A voice that made Magnus convulse as if struck by lightning. The woman who stepped into the cursed circle bore the weathered features of the far north, but her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. She wore simple traveling clothes, but around her throat hung a pendant identical to Eric's, except hers was carved from what looked suspiciously like human bone. Mother, Magnus whispered, and the word fell from his lips like a tombstone. But you died in childbirth when Eric was born. I died because my firstborn son needed power, Helga Ironwife said calmly, her ancient eyes never leaving Eric's agonized face. The soul trade had to begin somewhere, Magnus, and a mother's willing death for her child's future, well, that carries the deepest magic of all. Eric's world shattered into fragments sharper than a broken blade. The woman he'd never known, whose death had supposedly torn his father's heart in half, stood before him, wearing the calm satisfaction of someone whose decades-long plan had finally reached completion. The Apache shamans, the Saxon blood sorcerers, even little Astrid's winter fever, Helga continued, circling the paralyzed group like a hunting wolf. All of it orchestrated to drive Magnus deeper into soul trading, to collect the spiritual debt necessary for the true working. She gestured to Eric's burning scars. Every innocent he sold strengthened the binding. Every betrayal carved these marks deeper into his son's destiny. The golden pendant pulsed brighter, and Eric felt something fundamental shifting in his very bones. His hands began to elongate, nails hardening into claws. His teeth ached as they pushed forward into fangs. The willing sacrifice was never Eric's life, Astrid giggled, her child's laughter echoing with the voices of all Magnus's victims. It was his humanity save one innocent soul through compassion, and become the vessel for every innocent soul father murdered for gold. Leaf's iron pendant began to smoke and crack as Eric's transformation accelerated. A soul reaper, he breathed in horror. You're turning him into a soul reaper. Helga smiled with maternal pride. My grandson will hunt down every soul trader in the 9 realms, every merchant who trades in human misery, every warrior who sells the innocent for profit. Her eyes fixed on Magnus with the cold love of glacial ice, starting with his own father. The scars across Eric's chest blazed like forge fire, and when he raised his head, his pale eyes had become voids that reflected the faces of countless murdered innocents. Magnus's legendary blade turned to ash in his trembling hands as his son, his transformed, hungry son, smiled with a mouth full of fangs, sharper than winter itself. But as Eric's fanged mouth opened to deliver the Soul Reaper's kiss of death to his father, the golden pendant around his neck suddenly went cold as winter stone. The transformation halted mid-breath, claws retracting, fangs dulling back to human teeth. Helga's ancient eyes widened with something Eric had never seen before, genuine terror. "Impossible," she breathed, stumbling backward as if struck by an invisible fist. "The binding is absolute. The transformation cannot be." Stopped by a mother's true love, came a voice soft as falling snow. Every head turned toward the speaker, and Magnus made a sound like a man drowning in ice water. There, standing in the doorway of the trading post, was a woman whose gentle features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Eric's own. But where Helga carried the weight of centuries in her gaze, this woman's eyes held only the warmth of hearth fires and the fierce protection of a she-wolf guarding her cub. "Sigrid," Magnus whispered, his voice breaking on the name like a ship on hidden rocks. The woman, Eric's true mother, smiled with lips that had never known the taste of innocent blood. Around her throat hung no pendant of bone or iron, but a simple wooden cross that seemed to glow with inner warmth in the cursed air. "Hello, my love," she said to Magnus, but her eyes were fixed on Eric's face with the desperate hunger of 15 years of separation. "Hello, my beautiful boy," Helga snarled, her maternal mask slipping to reveal something reptilian beneath. "You died, Sigrid! I watched you die! I arranged your death myself when Magnus chose you over his demon mother." Sigrid stepped fully into the circle, and where her feet touched the cursed ground, small, white flowers began to bloom through the charred earth. "Yes, you poisoned me on Eric's birthnight, but death, I discovered, is not always permanent when true love anchors the soul." The wooden cross at her throat pulsed with golden light, the same light that had been blazing from Eric's pendant. And suddenly Eric understood with crystalline clarity what he was truly seeing. "The cross," he breathed. "It's not Christian, is it?" Sigrid shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the son she'd never been allowed to hold. "It's older than Christ, older than the Norse gods themselves. It's the crossing of the world tree's branches, the symbol of perfect balance between light and shadow, life and death." Her gaze shifted to Magnus with infinite sadness. "Your father carried one just like it when we first met, but Helga convinced him to trade it away for power over the dead." Magnus fell to his knees as if his very bones had turned to water. The truth hit him like an avalanche of stone and shame. Every soul he'd traded, every innocent death he'd arranged, all of it orchestrated not by desperation or greed, but by his own demonic mother's hunger for spiritual power. "I never meant," he whispered, his legendary strength crumbling like ancient parchment. "Sigrid, I thought I was protecting our son, building him a legacy of wealth and influence." "You were feeding me," Helga cut in, her form beginning to waver and shift like heat shimmer. "Every soul you sold charged the binding stronger. Every betrayal carved deeper channels for my influence." Her features began to elongate, revealing the skull face of something far older and hungrier than any Norse demon. And when my grandson finally transformed into the perfect Soul Reaper, I would have had enough power to devour the spirits of both Christian and pagan alike. But Sigrid was walking toward Eric now, her wooden cross blazing brighter with each step. "The moment you chose compassion over blood debt," she said, her voice thick with pride and sorrow, "you broke every chain she'd wrapped around your soul." She reached out and touched his scarred chest, and the runic marks began to fade like morning frost in sunlight. "But mother," Eric gasped, his voice young and lost, "if you're alive, then who—" His words died in his throat as he turned to look at the creatures that had been Leif and Astrid. They were dissolving like smoke in wind, their forms cracking apart to reveal empty air beneath. All of it, every ghost, every vengeful spirit, every murdered sibling, all of it had been Helga's elaborate deception to drive Magnus deeper into spiritual debt. The only real death had been Sigrid's. And now that Eric's true mother had returned, the ancient demon who had worn his grandmother's face for 15 years was about to discover what happened when a Soul Reaper's transformation was turned inside out. Eric's eyes blazed, not with the hunger of the damned, but with the righteous fury of the truly innocent. And his claws were growing back, but this time they thirsted for demon blood. As Eric's claws blazed with righteous fire, ready to tear the demon masquerading as his grandmother into smoking shreds, Sigrid's gentle hand touched his shoulder, and the world exploded into agony. The wooden cross around her throat didn't just glow. It erupted with searing light that burned through Eric's transformed flesh like molten iron through snow. His scream tore across the cursed ground as his mother's touch branded runic symbols into his very bones. Symbols that writhed and pulsed with a hunger deeper than any demon's. "My beautiful, stupid boy," Sigrid whispered, and her voice carried the weight of avalanches and the cruel laughter of winter storms. "Did you really think your grandmother was the only one who could wear borrowed faces?" The gentle features Eric had thought belonged to his true mother began to shift and blur, revealing something underneath that made Helga's demon skull look like a child's carving. Where soft brown eyes had been, twin voids opened, not empty. It was about conquest, about binding the old gods in chains of guilt and shame. The wooden symbol blazed brighter, and Eric felt his very essence being torn apart and rewoven like threads on a cosmic loom. "Every soul your father sold didn't go to your grandmother, sweet Eric. They went to me." Magnus crawled backward across the charred earth, his legendary courage finally shattered completely. "But the flowers," he gasped, "where you walked, white flowers, grew from bone meal." The thing wearing Sigrid's face finished with motherly pride. "Every step I take is fertilized by the innocent dead. The more souls fed to me, the more beautiful my garden becomes." Helga's demon form was dissolving like smoke, but her ancient laughter echoed across the trading post. 20 years I spent thinking I was the architect of this harvest," she cackled. 20 years believing my son was feeding me power, all while the Christ demon wore my daughter-in-law's face and collected every soul I thought was mine." The wooden cross pulsed, and Eric felt his transformation completing, but not into a soul reaper, into something far worse. His claws weren't growing back to hunt demons. They were extending to harvest the living, to tear souls from still-breathing bodies and deliver them to the hungry void that had birthed Christianity itself. The willing sacrifice was never your humanity, my son, Sigrid cooed, stroking Eric's agonized face with fingers that left frostbite in their wake. It was Magnus's paternal love. Every soul he sold, he told himself, it was to build you a better future. He was feeding me his own capacity for love, meal by meal, year by year. Magnus's eyes went dead as the final truth crashed over him like a burial mound of stone and ice. Not just his victim's blood was on his hands. Every act of soul trading had been carving away pieces of his ability to truly love his son, delivering them to the ancient hunger that Christianity had brought to consume the pagan world. And now, Sigrid continued, her borrowed features melting away entirely to reveal a face carved from winter itself and hunger older than human memory. My perfect priest reaper will carry the cross to every pagan stronghold in the 9 realms. Every heathen temple will burn. Every Norse soul will feed my eternal garden. Eric's scream of rage and despair shook the very foundations of reality, as his father's 20 years of unknowing betrayal reached its culmination. But in the distance, beyond the cursed trading post, a sound began to rise that made even the Christ demon pause in her moment of triumph. War horns. Not Saxon, not Norse. Apache. And they were playing a tune that had been silent for 20 years, the song of the truly dead, returning to reclaim what was stolen from them. The Apache war horns crescendoed across the cursed ground, their ancient melody weaving through the air like smoke from sacred fires. But as the sound reached its peak, something impossible happened. The horns began playing in perfect harmony with Christian hymns that had no earthly source. Eric's transformation halted mid-scream as the dual music crashed over him like opposing tidal waves. The wooden cross around the Christ demon's throat flickered and dimmed, its borrowed light wavering for the first time since she'd revealed her true nature. No, she hissed, her winter-carved features contorting with something that might have been fear. The Apache spirits were destroyed. I consumed them myself when Magnus what? Came a voice from beyond the trading post walls, speaking perfect Norse with an Apache accent that made Magnus's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Chief Nalnish stepped into the cursed circle, but he was not as Eric had imagined him from Ayana's false memories. This was no bronze-skinned warrior in buckskin and war paint. This was a pale-eyed Norse giant wearing Apache ceremonial dress, silver hammer pendant gleaming against his chest, speaking the sacred words of both peoples with the authority of one born to command. "Hello, brother," he said to Magnus, his smile sharp as winter starlight. "It's been 23 years since you fled our father's hall." The words hit Magnus like a warhammer between the ribs. He crawled backward across the charred earth, shaking his head in denial that fooled no one. Impossible. Bjorn died in the Blood Eagle ceremony. father sacrificed him to Odin when the Christian armies needed a Norse prince to lead their conquest of the Apache sacred lands. Nalnish finished calmly. Yes, I remember. Just as I remember my younger brother Magnus volunteering to trade with the heathen savages while I did the real work of conversion. Eric felt his very soul crack as understanding flooded through him like poison. The Christ demon, wearing his mother's face, stumbled backward, her ancient composure finally shattered. "But you're supposed to be dead," she whispered. "The ritual binding required your death. Magnus's guilt over sacrificing his brother was the foundation of everything." "Oh, Magnus did sacrifice me," Nalnish said, his pale eyes never leaving his brother's horrified face. "He delivered me to your Christian handlers, knowing full well I'd be tortured until I converted, knowing I'd be forced to lead the Apache genocide from within." The Norse Apache chief reached into his ceremonial pouch and withdrew something that made the very air scream. A wooden cross, identical to the one around the Christ demon's throat, except this one was carved from wood that had been soaked in innocent blood for 20 years. "Every Apache soul you thought you consumed," Nalnish continued, raising the blood-soaked cross high above his head, "was actually being stored in this." Waiting for the moment when Magnus's son would complete the willing sacrifice by choosing compassion over blood debt. The Christ demon's borrowed form began to crack and peel like old paint in fire. "The binding is mine," she shrieked. "Every soul Magnus sold, every innocent death, fed power to whoever held the true cross." Eric gasped, understanding crashing over him like an avalanche of stone. The golden pendant around his neck pulsed once, then shattered into dust. Its purpose finally complete. Nalnish smiled with an expression that held both Norse cunning and Apache vengeance in perfect, terrifying balance. The willing sacrifice was never about creating a soul reaper, nephew. It was about transferring all the spiritual power Magnus had unknowingly fed to Christianity. His blood-soaked cross blazed with unholy fire as hundreds of Apache war spirits poured forth from its wooden embrace. Back to the old gods who never forgot how to wage war on heaven itself. The Christ demon's scream shook the foundations of reality as she realized the trap 23 years in the making had finally snapped shut. But in the distance, church bells began to ring, and they were playing the ancient songs of Ragnarok. The church bells tolled their final death knell as the blood-soaked cross blazed in Nalnish's hands. But the sound that rose to meet them was not Christian hymn. It was the ancient war song of Ragnarok itself, played on Apache war horns by the spirits of the truly dead. The Christ demon's stolen flesh began to crack and peel like old bark in winter fire, revealing the writhing void beneath. Her scream shattered the air as centuries of stolen power poured from her like blood from a mortal wound, flowing back into the crosses held by both brothers, the false one crumbling to ash around her throat, the true one blazing with justice in Nalnish's grip. "The willing sacrifice," Nalnish said, his voice carrying the weight of two people's pain, "was never Eric's soul or Magnus's love. It was your certainty that the old gods were too weak to reclaim what you stole. Magnus crawled across the charred earth toward his son, his legendary strength finally broken, but his father's heart somehow made whole. Eric knelt to meet him, and when their hands touched, the last of the Christ demon's binding shattered like ice in spring thunder. "I'm sorry," Magnus whispered, tears cutting tracks through 20 years of accumulated shame. "For all of it. For her. For the souls." "I know, Father," Eric said, and his voice carried forgiveness deeper than any wound. "I know." The void where the Christ demon had stood began to collapse in on itself. But as it died, it spoke one final curse. "The Christians will come again. They always do. And next time, Nalnish said calmly, Apache war spirits swirling around him like winter wind made deadly. "We'll be ready." The cursed ground beneath their feet cracked one final time, then bloomed with white flowers, not fed by bone meal, but by rain that fell clean and sweet from a sky finally free of ancient hunger. 5 years later, Eric Magnusson stood at the edge of the trading post that had become something else entirely. A place where Norse merchants and Apache warriors gathered in peace, their children playing gods and spirits games that would have been impossible before that day of reckoning. Magnus had died the winter after the binding broke, but peacefully, with his son's hand in his and his brother's forgiveness warming his final breath. His grave bore no marker save a simple wooden cross, not Christian, but the crossing branches of the world tree, where all souls find their way home. Nalnish had returned to his people, carrying with him the promise that the sacred places would remain sacred, the trading would remain honest, and the children of both worlds would grow up knowing their true names. And Eric had become what he'd always been meant to be, not a soul reaper or a demon's pawn, but a bridge between worlds, a man whose compassion had rewritten the very foundations of fate itself. The Apache war horns still sang at sunset, but now they harmonized with Norse drinking songs, creating something new and wild and free. Some debts, Eric had learned, could only be paid with understanding, and some bindings could only be broken by choosing love over fear again. Onde se esta saga tocou sua alma, então escute o chamado do Scalde. A nossa jornada depende da força do nosso clã. E essa força é você. Você precisa se inscrever agora, para que os deuses do algoritmo não te façam perder nossas próximas lendas exclusivas. Este é o momento de mostrar seu valor. Esmague o botão de like para alimentar nossa fogueira e inunde os comentários com suas reações sobre este final. Suas teorias são o ouro do nosso tesouro. E o mais importante, compartilhe instantaneamente este vídeo com pelo menos 5 amigos que precisam conhecer este desfecho. Apenas os verdadeiros guerreiros do nosso clã entendem a importância destas ações. Não espere nem mais um segundo.